India and Pakistan will be 75 years old as independent nations next August. On August 14th, Pakistan, and August 15th, India. Over the next few months, well until August of 2022, we will, at the center, have quite a few conversations on where the two countries are. We will include Bangladesh also, which was part of undivided British India until 47 and part of Pakistan until 71. And yes, consider Sri Lanka and Nepal as well. Where these countries are politically, culturally, and purely human terms, and where they might be headed. Today's conversation is with Salman Rushdie. Salman is my guest for a seminar a third time in the last 18 years. I feel very touched by that. I first invited him to the University of Michigan when I was a professor there and director of the center, South Asia. And that, though the entire set of activities that took place there led to this book, published by the University of Michigan Press. And the occasion then was the premiere of Midnight's Children as a play by Royal Shakespeare Company. The University of Michigan had invested $2 million and Columbia had invested $1 million. And the premiere took place in Ann Arbor, and then it moved to New York, Columbia. He needs no introduction, and it would cut into our discussion time if I even try to read how many awards he has received from various societies, governments. Perhaps the Nobel is the only prize left, and hope it happens soon. The only award I will note for all of us is the Best Booker Award, given to Midnight's Children. I've read it so much that the cover is gone. I do have Midnight's Children, the first page, but the cover is gone. The novel was published in 82. It received the Booker Prize
81.
in
81.
Thank you. It received the Booker Prize in 82.
81.
81. This says first published in 82, so something is the matter.
That's the paperback.
Okay, all right. Okay, so it got the Best Booker Award, Best Booker Prize winner in 40 years by public vote. And today, we will engage him in a conversation. He gave a lecture last time he was here. We'll engage him in a collective conversation. And upon reflection, I have reversed the order in which the conversation will take place. The advertisement says politics, religion, literature, India and Pakistan. We will start with literature because it is fair to say the literature has the first claims on his time. So Professor Gauri Viswanathan, who was also with me at Michigan 18 years ago, will conduct that conversation. She is class of 1933 professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia, and also the director of its South Asia Institute. For religion, I have invited my colleague, Shahzad Bashir, Aga Khan Professor of Islamic Humanities and a Professor of History here at Brown. And the reason is very clear. When I look back upon what we did at the University of Michigan, it became clear there was a notable gap in our offerings and in our engagement. there was no conversation on religion per se. There was a political conversation which appeared in this book as the political Rushdie, which I conducted. And there was a literary conversation which appeared in this book as the literary Rushdie, which Gauri conducted. And Shahzad, as a religion scholar from whom we are learning so much, especially Islam, will engage Salman in a conversation about religion, and it's absolutely important, certainly after the Satanic verses. Each of us will spend 20 to 25 minutes, and we will then open up for audience questions. So we perhaps will go on, the panel will go on till 3:25, 3:30, and then we'll have your questions. When the questions are asked, we'll set up mics here so you can come and ask. And now that since the panel is about to begin, we will be at the table rather than here. I just use this podium to make these opening remarks. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Salman and Gauri and Shahzad for joining us. Literature first, Gauri.
Thank you so much, Ashu, for inviting me. I would say this is an occasion for me to reunite with Salman. I think we do this every 5-10 years or so. So it is really a great honor for me to be here. Great honor and privilege to be in conversation with Salman along with Shahzad and Ashu. I know that the subtitle of our session is India and Pakistan. So I wanted to begin by first speaking to the importance of South Asia in your recent work. And I am actually going to focus much of my questions and comments on your recent novels and also your collection of essays. I see that, childhood and the depiction of childhood is still a very prominent part of your novels. And I'm looking at Quichotte and the earlier one, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights, and so many of the earlier novels as well. And even though the recent novels are set in the US, and you do have Indian origin characters in these novels. And these novels do begin with childhood, which is generally set in the Indian subcontinent. So I was curious to know whether it is through childhood that you are, in a sense, holding on to South Asia as a major subtext of your novels.
Well, yeah, that's true, I think. I mean, as they say, the child is father of the man. And so if you want to understand the adult, you often have to understand the child. And I think that's been, I mean, leaving aside India, Pakistan, leaving aside the point of origin, just as a way of writing about character, it has always seemed to me to be relevant what kind of childhood a character has had. For me, of course, my childhood was spent in Bombay. So it's important to me for that reason. And one of the things that, for example, in 2 years, 8 months, that happens to the Indian origin character who's at the center of the book is that he discovers, in a way that I think many of us have discovered, that you can't go home again, not because you can't catch a plane, but because home isn't there anymore. The world you came from has gone, and that what is in its place doesn't feel like home. So that kind of loss, the loss of home, not because you're not there, but because it's not there, is something which I've been thinking about in these books. I mean, it's interesting. I have never yet managed to write a book that didn't have an Indian central character. I kind of wanted to, but it doesn't seem to work out. And I have now written, we were talking about it over lunch, I've written a play which doesn't have an Indian central character, because I've taken the liberty of writing a new Greek tragedy, which is about Helen of Troy, who, as far as I know, is not from India. So that's the first time, in a lifetime. And it really did feel different. But in the books, I've never managed it. And I sort of have diminishing interest in trying to do it. Actually, I just think this is what I do. These are the people I know about and who I want to write about. So yeah, these three last novels, which are all in a way very American novels, still have at their heart the subject of India, the subject in particular of Bombay. Because I don't know, I've always felt more close affinity to cities than to countries. I feel much closer to Bombay than to India. I feel much closer to London than to Britain, and much closer to New York than to America. Sorry, Boston.
I also wonder whether the persistence of the Indian subcontinent appears not just through the immigrant narrative, which is there in so many of your novels, both recent and some of the earlier ones, but that the persistence of South Asia is there in this mingling of literary styles that you focus on. And in your collection of essays, you talk about various genealogies of the wonder tale. There's the wonder tale that's drawn from Panchatantra, from Katha Sarit Sagra on the one hand, but then there's also the wonder tale that's drawn from the European literary tradition of Tristram Shandy, Agunta Grass, Tyndrum. These are, there are different genealogies that you describe. And I wonder whether this is the way that you have actually retained the persistence of the South Asia focus, even though, these recent novels do, represent your, as you said, the US.
I've lived here for more than 20 years now. So it's not unreasonable that the books should, to some extent, live here as well. But I know where I'm from, and I'm still from there. And I do think that I've always loved the groups of folktale and fairy tale that all cultures have. And it's very interesting to look at the similarities and the differences, what we have in common in our mythologies, and what we don't have in common. It's very interesting to me, for example, that European fable, Aesop, so on, is almost always moralistic. It almost always says, don't be greedy, be nice to people, etc. What is wonderful, I think, about the Indian storehouse, like the Panchatantra fables, is they're not at all moralistic, because the bad guys often win. And as a result, they feel much more modern.
And I think that's one reason why, so many of the novels have this very dark aspect to them, because they don't have that easy moral resolution.
Because everybody thinks of India as the land of peace and love. It's not. I've always, there's a Panchatantra fable about a war between the owls and the crows. And at a certain point, one of the crows pretends to be a defector, defects to the owl side in order to find out the entrances of their caves. And then the crows come and light fires at the entrances of the caves, and all the owls die. The end. So, I love it because it feels like life. So I find in that case, the Indian storehouse, in a strange way, feels more contemporary than these moralizing tales, of a lot of Western mythology and folktale. I mean, for example, you mentioned Grass. I mean, Günter Grass has drawn on the brothers Grimm all his life. I mean, the Flounder, of course, comes from the story of the fisherman and his wife, but which is a completely moralistic story. That's the don't be greedy story. Mm-hmm. And he uses it differently. He doesn't use it moralistically, but that's where it comes from. So yeah, I mean, that's been for me, I mean, one of the reasons why I end up writing a play about mythology. It's just because it's been a lifetime interest of mine, all mythologies.
Well, actually, I did want to speak to you a little bit more about your interest in fantasy, because so many of your recent novels are deeply rooted in fantasy and enchantment. For instance, you have in this book 2 years. I'm just going to say 2 years. It's just too long to say the whole title.
My publisher said to me, the title's too long. And I said, yeah, but it's 2 years, 8 months, 20 nights adds up. It's 1,001 nights, and that's the point. And the publisher said, yeah, but the title's too long.
And I'm going to have to agree with your publisher now.
I agree with the publisher, but it's too late.
But for instance, in this novel, you have a mortal meeting with a jinn, and you have in Quichotte, a fictional character coexisting with a real one. So I'm interested in your thoughts on the limitations of the realist novel, which you certainly could have written if you had wanted to. And realist novel, which, following Milan Kundera, you note is sometimes condemned to endless repetitiveness. And the implication is that one reaches a point when nothing new is to be discovered, and a writer then is compelled to take recourse to other means of revealing truths. So what I would like to know is, how is fantasy a medium for truth-telling?
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a big answer, but I'll try and compress it. One of the things I think is about the realist tradition in the novel, as it came to its pinnacle in let's say in the 19th century, with Stendhal, Balzac, etc. It seems to me that was based on a certain group of assumptions about the nature of the real, which were shared by the writers and the readers of that time. So the writers and readers would agree about the nature of the real, and the realist novel is built on that foundation. Now, you could say, and I think I would say, that consensus excluded a lot of people. It was predominantly white people, and it was predominantly petit bourgeois and upwards people, and it was very often very male. But there was that consensus that the writer could expect that his readers would see the world in substantially the same way as he saw the world. That consensus has broken down. It simply doesn't exist anymore. One man's up is another man's down. And one man's truth is another man's fake news. And we live in this world in which there no longer exists an agreement about reality. And it seems to me, therefore, as a writer in this world, that I have to recognize that, that realism isn't reality anymore. And so then the question is, what else is? And I try and answer that in different ways.
So does fictiveness then stake a claim for not being the real or being the truth itself, but by claiming itself as an independent area?
Well, I think so. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of writers who will give you the counter argument. But I think so. I think we are all people who make things up all the time. To some extent, we all dream, interestingly or not interestingly, but we all do it. We all have means of perception which are not just what's in the newspaper, and so I think it's reasonable to try and use all the tools in the box. It just seems to me that if you're writing a novel, it's like having an orchestra in front of you, and you have to decide which instruments you use. And sometimes you write for this instrument and sometimes for that. And so my view is I don't see myself as a realist or as a non-realist. I think the story that I'm trying to tell dictates the instruments that I use. So for example, in a novel like The Golden House, I mean, I would say it's 95% naturalistic because it wanted to be, and there's a little bit of surrealism where there's a president who is basically the Joker winning an election campaign. But then that happened. So it became retrospectively naturalistic. But I just think that we have many ways of telling each other the truth, and fable, folktale, fantasy, fairy tale has always been at the heart of all literatures. So it seems absurd to say, well, that's not how you do it, because you have to do it this way.
But I can't help feeling that in Quichotte, you are almost questioning some of the premises of an earlier novel, like 2 Years, where the line between the real and the unreal, between fantasy, is so blurred that that blurring becomes the opportunity for probing the nature of truth. In Quichotte, on the other hand, I feel almost as if you as a writer are now questioning whether going too far in the direction of staking the claims for fictiveness might lead to exactly the kinds of situations where there's a dissemination of fake news or false opinion. Well, it's that, it's that particular situation where the fictiveness that a writer can claim as a certain privilege then becomes a situation where it's as if there's a Pandora's box that has been opened.
Well, I mean, I think that's reasonable. I mean, I'm always arguing with myself. I'm always looking at the thing I did and thinking, well, what's wrong with that? Or what would I like to do instead of that? So I think a writer's, especially if you're lucky enough to have a long life in literature, one of the things you are doing all the time is questioning everything you did before, and trying to see what better you could do next. So that's true. I think that the books are sort of in dialogue with each other and maybe even arguing with each other. And I think that's okay. I don't want to be somebody who lays down the law, who says this is what it is and nothing else is it. Those are the people I feel myself in opposition to, people who do that. For me, it's just this endless questioning, which is a formal questioning and a linguistic questioning, as well as, if you like, a social one. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's no full stop. I mean, the only full stop is the one we can't avoid. So in that sense, all bodies of work are incomplete, unless you're Philip Roth and you decide to stop.
Well, on the point of the one thing that you can't stop, as you were saying earlier on, I was thinking about the. I think at some point you talk about storytelling. At least this is something as it appeared to me. I don't think you yourself say this, but that storytelling appears as a double-edged sword in your writings. Your essay, Wonder Tales, which leads your collection Languages of Truth. It's a glorious tribute to the staying power of the 1001 Arabian Nights, in which storytelling is a mode of survival for Shahrazad. But your novel, 2 Years, pictures itself in the opening as an anti-Shahrazad novel, in the sense that whereas Shahrazad saved herself by telling stories, in your novel Ibn Rushd faced danger by telling stories. So am I correct in describing storytelling as a double-edged sword?
I mean, yes, I'll agree with that. I do think Shahrazad is one of the most remarkable women in literature, because of the not only the courage of her decision to place herself in danger, but also her belief that stories can save you. Very improbable belief, actually. Stories more usually get people in trouble, as I have some knowledge of. But not only does she believe that, but she then demonstrates it. And not only does she save her life, but in the process of the 1001 Nights, she civilizes the king. But at the end of it, he is not the murderous person that he was at the beginning of it. I mean, he still killed several thousand women, but be that as it may, he's decided that's not a good thing to do by the end. And that idea that literature can have the power of civilization, is, I think, also a very profound idea. Whether it's true or not is something we can argue about, because I actually resist the idea that literature is good for you. There are great writers who were definitely bad for us. Louis Ferdinand Céline was a Nazi. T.S. Eliot was deeply anti-Semitic, etc. Writers are very often deeply flawed individuals, and yet nobody can deny the genius of Céline or of Eliot. It's just that it's not moral, and we go back to the fable that is not moralizing, So I think I resist the idea that literature should be virtuous, that it should be good for you. But I love the idea of Shahzad, that the power of literature is so great that it can change people. That I do believe. I do think that when we read a book that has deep meaning for us, it changes us in some way. The worldview of the book, to some degree, becomes our own. And I think that's how literature changes the world. It doesn't change the world by revolutions. It changes the world like that, one reader at a time.
So regardless of whether it's a source of survival or a source of danger, I take it that suppressing a story is not an option.
I don't think so. I also think the thing about stories is they want to be told. If you have a really good story to tell, it's really difficult not to tell it. If you know something really juicy about somebody that you really shouldn't say, it's really hard not to say it. My mother was a fantastic gossip. She was a gossip of world class. She knew where all the bodies were buried. She knew who was doing what to whom. And she used to tell me, then at a certain point she said, I'm going to stop telling you because you put it in your books and I get in trouble. But she didn't stop.
So there's just so much I would love to talk to you about, but I am running out of time. But I can't help asking a question about your fascination with the supernatural. There's this, I keep referring to 2 years because I absolutely loved it, and it was, maybe this is it because it spoke to me in terms of how I've been thinking about all these various heterodox systems like Gnosticism and Manichaeism, and your description of the jinns.
Yes.
I mean, it's just extraordinary. There was really nothing else that I've read like that. So forgive me if I do keep coming to it.
Go ahead, keep going.
But I did, there was one, but I was asking you about the supernatural.
Yeah.
And there's this really striking scene where, Ibn Rushd and Ghazali, his opponent, are both dead. And they're in their graves, right? And Ibn Rushd, lying dead in his tomb in Cordoba, he communicates with his dead opponent, Ghazali, continuing their long-standing dispute about reason and faith beyond the grave.
Dust to dust.
Yes, dust to dust, but even beyond that. And then he's visited in his grave by Dunya, his former lover, who reveals herself to be of the spirit world. She's a jinn. Now, you are not an occult writer. I'm not saying that you are. But you draw upon some of the conventions of occultism.
But this is simple,
make
isn't it?
your point.
I'm just saying people's lives don't end when they die. Especially if we're talking about people's ideas. Here you have Ibn Rushd and Ghazali, two very opposite ideas of Islam, and that argument continues. So the argument continues to this day in many ways. So just a way of dramatizing that is to suggest that these two dead people in their graves turned to dust can still talk to each other, because in a way they are still talking to each other. So that seems to me a way of using the surreal to talk about something real. So I mean that's an exact example of the way in which surrealism can be used to tell a kind of truth.
No, I saw surrealism in your, like in Quichotte, which I think has a lot of surrealist imagery, like the mastodons on New Jersey Turnpike. And it just struck me, the wonderful exhibition at the Met just opened on surrealism beyond borders. And when I saw it, I was actually thinking of your mastodons, because there was a sense that there's this critique in the imagery, in the grotesque imagery.
Well, what I'm trying to write about is a world in which, well, if I have the time, I'll just say that the mastodons are slightly stolen from Eugene Ionesco, who wrote about rhinoceroses. The rhinoceros, his great play, is about a small French town in which people start turning into rhinoceroses. And I was cast in this play when I was a student at Cambridge. And I was like 19 or something. And I said to the director, I said, I don't completely understand what's going on. I mean, what's this about? And he said, Salman, it's about fascism. I said, oh. I said, how is it about fascism? and he said, well, this play is written in the aftermath of the Nazi period, and it's about how your neighbors can suddenly turn into monsters, about how people that you've spent your lives with in this village can suddenly become so unrecognizable to you that you can't speak to them, they can't speak to you, and you're frightened of them. That's why it's about fascism. And I said, oh, that's good. And so then I'm writing this novel about America, in which I think something like that might be happening. That our neighbors are turning into people we can't talk to anymore, we can't understand, and sometimes we're frightened of them. And so I thought about Ionesco's play, and I thought I can't have rhinoceroses because he's got rhinoceroses. So I had mastodons, pink elephants, they're funnier. But that's where it came from. It came from that 19-year-old light bulb moment.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. We could go on. I mean, I can, yeah, all right. How long have you got? We haven't got time. All right, yes.
Let's turn to Shahzad Bashir now for a conversation on religion.
So thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. And as unlike with Gauri and Ashu, this is the first time with me. So it's a special pleasure. And thank you to Ashu for including me in this discussion. So as I was trying to think about how to bring in the question of religion, the way it ended up happening is actually a perfect placement between literature and politics.
Could you hear him at the back, or is he audible at the back? Okay.
Doesn't seem.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so what I would like to do is to discuss things in two parts. One having to do with the literature, and another having to do with language. I think the language question then gets to politics, and the literature question actually continues very much with what Gauri has already started. So first of all, I was very happy to hear that you say that you're constantly arguing with yourself, with your old self, and what is on the paper. So the question I wanted to ask was about an essay that I first read many decades ago. It came out just about when the Satanic verses controversy was starting. It was called Is Nothing Sacred? And where you argued meticulously and went through the argument as to whether literature should be considered sacred. And after laying out the arguments for why it could be considered sacred, you argued that actually it should not be considered sacred. And the main point you were making there, if I understood correctly, was that the issue is your concern with the sacred literature is precisely that it stands outside of the ordinary commerce of words and ideas. And literature's purpose is precisely to open up that conversation. So if it becomes sacred, it actually goes into the problematic aspect of the use of language. So that was the argument that you presented, but then you argued further that there is something we shouldn't call it sacred, or we don't have to call it sacred, but that does have to be preserved for social purposes, which is the ability to imagine. And the idea that imagination is something that is essential for a well-functioning, healthy society, and that if literature comes to occupy that space through which imagination is actually put into action, that is something that is actually very much worth fighting for. So my first question is, would you argue with this now, or would you agree still that this is a good way of thinking?
On the whole, I agree with it, but I'd put it slightly differently. I wrote a short story recently, which was in the New Yorker, which was about an old man sitting in a piazza in Italy, and the piazza is a place where people come and argue, and he sits there and watches their arguments and enjoys it. And I think it's that piazza that's the sacred space. I think it's that place where you can go to say anything and be argued with, and the importance of it is not that somebody wins the argument. It's that the argument can happen, and that the argument can go on happening, and people can change their minds or not change their minds, be hardened in their convictions, but that the place of discourse exists. There's a wonderful, I'll go to, we haven't yet spoken about Hindu mythology very much, but in the Natya Shastra, which is the ancient Hindu text about the performing arts, there's a wonderful moment in which the great god Indra, there they are all in heaven and everything is running smoothly. And they're a little bored. So the great god Indra invents the concept of entertainment. And he appoints a junior god, who is a god who has 100 sons, to say, do some entertainment. Right? And so the junior god creates the first play. And in this play, he reenacts the origin story of the gods, which is when the Devas, the gods, were in battle with the Ashuras, who we would now call demons, but they weren't called that then. They were just another set of supernatural beings. And the Devas defeat the Ashuras, and then they become the gods, right? So the play reenacts this. But unfortunately, some Ashuras have got into the auditorium, which is also a new concept. Auditorium here, stage there, you sit here, we act there, that's called entertainment. Anyway, the Ashuras they dislike the play. And so they try to, so to speak, ban it. They throw spells, curses at the actors and paralyze them. So Indra has to intervene, which he does by expelling the Ashuras and etc. And then there's this extraordinary text where Indra positions 4 of the most senior gods at the 4 corners of the stage. And he himself sits at the center of the stage. And he says, this is a sacred space. He says, in this space, anything can be said. And anything must be listened to. And the reason is that I say so. And so this extraordinary defense of free expression that takes place in the Natya Shastra thousands of years before anybody in the West had developed the idea of free expression is very beautiful, and I think I would say that now. I would say that space, the stage of Indra, that's the space that should be preserved. And if there's anything like a sacred space, it would be that.
Okay, thank you. Actually, so this, your answer to this actually is very relevant to the question of the question about religious language that I wanted to ask, but I'll come back to that. But in going with your answer to the the question of this space. And as you're describing this space, underlying that is still the issue of the ability to imagine in terms of a space that is created such that such a discussion takes place in a way outside of normative circumstances. So as you're saying, with the creation of an auditorium and stage, etc. So, I mean, I wonder if to put it, this is to put it rather starkly, that the difference between literature and say religious understandings, it's not about the lack of imagination in one or the other, but it's actually a contestation regarding what is the place of imagination within human existence. So as I was trying to think of how to put it in a rather sharply, I would say that the religious argument about that kind of literary sensibility of imagination is that it's neutered, that it has been taken away from investments in politics and the ordinary messy business of life in order to create this artificial place where this discussion happens. And so it is it doesn't have the same potency that the religious imaginary would want. The literary answer to this, I think, would be looking at the religious imagination.
It's cutting in and out.
Okay. So the critique from the literary side would be that the religious imagination is actually claustrophobic. It is already tied down to ontology and epistemology and cosmology, and therefore it is not actually free. So it's actually not accomplishing what imagination can do. Now, so if we understand it they're actually fighting over the same contested space, does that then kind of diminish the difference between religious imagination and literary imagination, and takes us to the rather a slightly different question of what was at stake for the two different parties?
You know, that's really a great question, because like many atheists, I'm obsessed with religion. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about it. And of course, some of the greatest and oldest stories that exist are stories that were created as sacred stories. You know, the Old Testament, for example. You know, I mean, as far as I know, the book, people now even accept that the book of Job is actually fiction. I don't think I'm even saying anything startling, but it's great fiction. You know, and if one wrote a story today about somebody being swallowed by a whale, that would be thought to be magic realism. You know, but there it is in the Old Testament. You know, so how can it be? Must be the truth. I think there's a clear relationship between the sacred and the profane imagination. And indeed, it's quite clear that all storytelling began as religious storytelling and moved towards the secular / profane away from that. But that's the origin point. You know, the Greek myths were once the Greek religion, you know, and they had priests and they had temples. And if you said the wrong thing, you would be in trouble because of some god or other and his acolytes disapproving of it. So yeah, of course there's that relationship. I think the difference is, the difference between the secular imagination and the religious imagination is the willingness to question first principles. You know, and the first principle of religion is there a God? If you can't ask that question, you are not free. So the purpose of true imagination in my mind is to always question from the first principle upwards, you know, and if you can't do that, if you can only start from the second principle, then you are limited in what you can do. And to my mind, that's why the purely religious imagination is in the end unappealing, because it doesn't ask the difficult question, you know, and what is art about if it's not about asking the difficult question? You know, I mean, lots of art doesn't ask the difficult question, but my view is why bother if you're not doing that? You know, and so I think that's but obvious, the relationship is obvious between the two.
Thank you. Actually, there's a very famous book entitled Did the Greeks Believe Their Myths? And the answer the historian comes up with is, they believed it when they needed to. So there's a pragmatic aspect with respect to religion as well, that in terms of its usage of the...
Yeah, I mean, I think the Greeks knew that if you climbed Mount Olympus, you wouldn't find a bunch of gods up there. It's not that high.
So let me move to the second question, which is about language. And that in some ways gets to also to politics, and especially South Asian politics. So my impetus for this question comes from the work of Bruno Latour, who published a book. It was published in the late 90s, first in French, and then translated to English. And the English title is Rejoicing, or the Torments of Religious Language. Mm. And his argument there is, it's a very interestingly tortured book. And his argument has to do with, and is contextualized very specifically having to do with French Catholicism. Mm. And he suggests that the problem that we, with us as moderns not understanding religious language, is that we have made religion a question of belief. So, so in a way, actually very much like what you said earlier, he said it actually doesn't really matter whether you're a believer or an atheist. If you're concerned with belief, you're basically part of the same economy in which religion has come to be within modern context, especially modern European context. So he says that if we go with this perspective, what ends up happening is that when we read the use of religious language that has not been constrained by this new framework, we are looking for we ask the wrong questions. Mm-hmm. So to look at a religious text and ask the question, what did these people believe, for him is to completely misunderstand the purpose. It's because it's to ask an informational question. And his suggestion is that religious language is never about informational question. It's actually about a transformational question. Religious questions, when we look at the Bible, when angels talk or when God talks, then no information is being provided. It's actually a transformation that is happening. So he suggests that, thank you. So he suggests that essentially we have to kind of get to this different understanding away from this kind of transactional or informational notion of religious language. Now, some of this applies to South Asia, if we understand, certainly in the case of Hindutva or Islamism, etc. But it seems to me that part of the difference between Europe and South Asia is that other religious language is actually still alive. Mm-hmm. The paradigmatic question that Latour puts is that the question should not be, do you believe in global warming? The question should be, instead, for the same issue, the question should be, do you love me? It should be the question that actually transforms the two parties within which the question is happening. So it seems to me that in South Asia, across the different religious contexts, that question, the ultimate religious question still remains, do you love me? And all the different answers that have been there over the 20th century. And that provides this potency to religion in South Asia that's missing in certainly Western Europe.
That's so interesting. I mean, I do think that if I'm reading a religious text, I don't really at that moment care whether people believe it or not. I'm interested in the question of beauty. And in much religious language, there is immense beauty. It's why you can be moved by hymns, even if you don't believe in the Christian religion. It's why you can read the Old Testament with incredible joy, because it's especially the King James Version, the authorized version. And I mean the revised version also, but they're extraordinary texts which anybody with any love of language will respond to. And certainly writers, if they don't have a love of language, what do they have? So yes, I agree with all that. I think the difference is that where I separate myself a bit from that argument with relevance to South Asia is that in both India and Pakistan, in both Hinduism and Islam, religion has been, in a certain sense, militarized. You know, and so it's no longer about do you love me? You know, it's about do what we say or we will kill you. You know, if you're eating that pig, we will burn you alive. You know, and that's the problem. That's because that seems to me to degrade religious language. You know, and to reduce it to something much more banal, in a way, which we were saying over lunch, how in the old India, all of it belonged to all of us. You know, we could go to church on Christmas Eve. We could, if we were Muslims, we could celebrate Diwali. If we were Hindus, we could celebrate Eid. These things didn't feel exclusive to us. You know, that it felt as if the whole culture was all of ours. You know, and that I thought that comes back to the idea of beauty. You know, I don't believe literally that there was God with an elephant head. You know, but I used to love the Ganpati festival more than almost anything. You know, certainly more than Eid. The only thing about Eid is you got new clothes at the foot of your bed and your family gave you money. That was good, but it wasn't a party, you know, whereas Ganesh Chaturthi was a party and Holi is a party. And that was good, you know, and we all did all of it. And that was beautiful. And I think now that we can't, that's diminishing. And I think it's that addition of political violence to the question of religious language that in a way changes the subject. Thank you.
Thank you. We turn to politics now. First, justification for why we should engage Salman Rushdie in a political conversation. Religion is directly connected to Satanic verses, and he is, of course, a novelist and a now playwright. And so literature is absolutely the foundation of the corpus of his output. So why should we not abandon him, if you will, no insult intended, to literary and religious scholars? Why shouldn't we abandon him to Gauri and Shahzad? Well, the reason is quite simple. And I'll, in the interest of time, I'll just read from what appeared in this book. Salman Rushdie is an intense political being. He has often claimed and demonstrated through his work that political context plays a significant role in his storytelling and artistic imagination. Consider briefly The Midnight Children. Through its events, characters, and stories, Midnight Children covers a long and significant period of South Asian politics, 1918 to 1978, especially after 47, but there are references to Gandhi bursting on the scene in 1918, changing the freedom movement, generating new language, generating over time new consciousness, and to some arguments, a Hindu-Muslim divide of a sort, which led to partition, to some arguments, not to all arguments. The novel's end roughly coincides with a significant political landmark in India, the end of the only formal dictatorship of post-independence India, which was the emergency. Whether India will have another dictatorship formally, we don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Informally, for some, it's already one. But formally, no. Whereas the constitution was suspended. Its freedoms were suspended between 1975 and 1977. And if you think of Shame, a novel, what he wrote after Midnight Children, his third novel, which I really love. It's a novel about Pakistan, or to quote him, a novel about a place not quite Pakistan, unquote. As he, of course, as you can see, as he playfully described it. Generals play a very big role in that novel. And the whole idea, one of the central ideas of the novel, or central images of the novel, that Pakistan is an insufficiently imagined nation. A character speaks. It's a profoundly political idea, and it comes out of character's mouth. Hindu nationalist politics constitutes an important part of the Moor's Last Sigh, novel published in 1995. So we can't abandon him to Gauri and Shahzad alone. Let me do some political engagement here. So he knows that I was going to ask this, and I hope he's ready with his answer. Here is what Salman wrote in 2000 when he visited India after a gap of 12 to 13 years, a separation forced by the fatwa. Quote, I have left India many times. The first time was when I was 13 and a half and went to boarding school in Rugby, England. Since then, my characters have frequently flown west from India. And in novel after novel, their author's imagination has returned to it. This perhaps is what it means to love a country. That its shape is also yours. The shape of the way you think, the way you feel, the way you dream, that you can never leave, unquote. I'm sorry if I have a lump in my throat. I've always had a lump in my throat when I've read this passage.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. I mean, I think one of the secrets, not only of a writer's life, but maybe of life, is to know who you are. And to know who you are means knowing where you came from. And for me, I mean, I started out with a kind of false start as a writer with a fantasy novel that didn't really work. And I thought a lot after that about why, what was wrong with it, you know, and the answer to that was Midnight Children. The answer to that was go back where you came from, to use a racist slogan. But I thought that's what I should do. I should go back and start from where I started and see where that brought me, you know, and yeah. So, you know, the world is full these days of writers who are out of place. You know, one of the things I know through my work with PEN America is how many writers now need refuge in countries which are not their own countries. You know, and so this is the question of origins, the question of what you bring with you, what you hold in your heart, you know, is something that a lot of writers have to face. And certainly for that long period when I couldn't go to India, that was my position. And you mentioned the Moor's Last Sigh, and I remember being quite worried about it because it was the first adult, I wrote Haroun and the Sea of Stories, but it was the first adult novel that I had written since the Satanic Verses. And so, you know, there were a lot of people watching. And for me, the greater worry was that it was the first time I had written a novel about India without having been able to go to India. And one of the things that I've always really wanted my work not to be was the work of an outsider. I wanted the work to feel like it belonged to the place that it was about. And I thought, yeah, I mean, I haven't been there for 6 or 7 years at that point, 6 years. And I would have hated people to respond to it by saying, well, what does he know now? He doesn't know anything, you know? And for me, the great victory of that novel is that I had friends calling me up from India saying, you bastard, you must have come here. Why didn't you tell us? I said, no, I didn't come. He said, no, you definitely did. How do you know all this stuff? And I thought, okay, good. I got away with it. But that yeah, I feel that sense of deep connection, and even since some of these we've saying, Gauri and I were saying, some of the recent books have looked away from India for a lot of them. I mean, I'm back, I'm writing a book which is completely set in India now. So it never goes away. It's always there. And it's you look as a writer for ways of understanding the world you're in. I mean, I think if you look at any writer's body of work, that's essentially what they're wrestling with. What is going on? What is my place in the world? What is happening to the world? That's your question, and for me, that point of origin has always been the place from which I start, and I may not end up there, but it's always where I start. And it appears to be where I'm ending up, so there we are. So everything comes around.
So other than Bombay, you have lived a lot of your life in London, Cambridge, perhaps 4 years or so, in London, then New York, now 20 years. Bombay is your land of origin, and you can never leave Bombay, you say. And that's what it means to love. What role have London and New York played in your literary imagination, in your work?
Oh God, there's so much, I mean, how could one live in England for so long and not be affected by English literature? For me, because as you know, the novel in India is not an ancient form. It's a couple of 100 years old. If you want to look at the history of the form, you have to look outside India. I mean, you mentioned, or maybe you mentioned, Gauri, I can't remember, Tristram Shandy, but I mean, books like that were very important for me when I read them, and writers, I mean, Charles Dickens is incredibly important for me. I actually think of Charles Dickens as a great Indian writer, because that Dickensian city, this is a big, rotting, corrupt place, is exactly like an Indian city now. In the same way, as Jane Austen is a great Indian writer, because these brilliant, oppressed women, having to settle for husband hunting when they're actually so much better than that. Again, transport them to India and they fit right in. So you don't even have to, I mean, I found those affinities, in books that I was reading, which were Western books, and what I love about Dickens, first of all, I love his names. He's a great namer. Wackford Squeers, Oliver Twist. These are fantastic names, which nobody ever had, but now they've become a part of English literature. He just made them up. The ability to invent names that have never existed and make them feel completely not plausible. Very, very hard, believe me. Writers always think very hard about naming, yeah. But also he has this gift. He has this panoramic gift that he can look at the whole of society. He's able to portray like a pickpocket over here and an archbishop over there. He can look at the bottom of society and the top, and very, very brilliantly at the middle, at the petit bourgeois world, shopkeepers. The whole of society is available to him. And that breadth of vision, I thought that's something to aspire to.
Yeah, I should have added one more sentence to my question, though. So this is a literary take on my question, and has it informed political imagination also? Living in London, living in New York.
Well, I mean, look, let's talk about the Enlightenment. The interesting thing about the French Enlightenment is that it was quite clear to those writers that their enemy was not the state. Their enemy was the church. And they deliberately set out, because the church at that point it had many weapons with which to impose its reality on the common people. It had anathema, it had excommunication, it had, a whole range of tools which could be used to limit what could be said, what could be thought, what the world could be. And the writers of the Enlightenment decided, I think in many ways consciously decided, that they had to break the power of the church to set limits on thought. And they did. At the end of the French Enlightenment, the church no longer had those powers. Things like Diderot's novel, The Nun, the work of Rousseau, the work of Montesquieu, the work of Voltaire, created the modern idea of intellectual freedom. And of course, exported to America, created the American view of freedom. America's idea of freedom is entirely based on the truths of the French Enlightenment. And so, yeah, you live in this world and you read this stuff and it makes you think, yes, I think that. And I'm aware of the fact that the Enlightenment writers had many personal flaws. We go back to, Eliot and Selim. They were not perfect people. They had real problems if you start looking at them as human beings. But what they did do was to achieve this separation between thought and religious repression. And that's important to me. That's important to me. One of the reasons I came to live in America was, to put it simply, the First Amendment. Different countries, even in the free world, so-called free world, in the West, let's say, have placed the limiting points in different places. In Germany, it's a crime to deny the Holocaust. You can see why. But the question is whether that glorifies people who get criminalized by Holocaust denial, but otherwise they would just be irrelevant, is a question. In England, the Race Relations Act makes it illegal to say racist things. You can be sent to jail. The First Amendment actually places the definition of freedom much more widely. And when I first came to America, I thought, what do I think about that? Because I had no problem with the Race Relations Act. I thought, that's fine. If racists get sent to jail, I have no problem with that. And then you come to a country which allows the Ku Klux Klan to speak, without being punished.
You can be politically punished for that, but you can't be legally.
You can't be legally punished. Yeah. And I thought, what do I think about that, really? And in the end, I thought, okay, I would prefer to know where the assholes are, and I prefer to know what they think and what their home address is. Because I don't think bad ideas go away by being made taboo and by being swept under the carpet. I think sometimes they become more powerful by being given the glamour of being taboo, being forbidden. And so I came round to thinking that maybe, problematic as it is, the breadth of definition of freedom of the First Amendment is better than these other limitations. But I'm aware of the other limitations, and I don't, this is one of the arguments I go on having with myself. And now we live in a country in which people seem to be forgetting the value of the First Amendment. And actually, particularly young people seem in increasing numbers to be willing to accept that certain kinds of ideas should be not given permission to exist. And I worry about that because, as I say, ideas don't disappear because you suppress them. Sometimes they increase in force. And so it's better to know where the enemy is so that you can argue with them and defeat them rather than prevent them from appearing. So, but it's an argument that needs to be had. But if you're asking me, what have I learned from being all these years in the West? It's these arguments about liberty, which I think are important. And I think, sadly, in South Asia, there is very little interest in the subject of individual liberty. the importance of the group is seen as being supreme, and that of the individual as being lesser. And so that's a shift.
My last question is about Pakistan. We have talked a lot about India. Half of your family lived in Pakistan, perhaps still does. They left Bombay, went to Karachi, and Pakistan was the centerpiece of your novel Shame. If looking back over since 1981, when your novels became so important and were read so widely, and Shame came after Mighty Nice Children. Looking back, how have you, as a political being or as a literary being, I don't know whether you want to separate the two, perhaps you don't, how have you responded to Pakistan?
Well, first of all, I should confess to a piece of, you mentioned shame, I should confess to a piece of family shame, which is that I have an uncle, he's no longer with us. I had an uncle by marriage who was a general in the Pakistan army, who was the founder and first head of the ISI, the inter-services, the Pakistan Secret Service, notorious, feared, the guardians of Osama bin Laden, the harborers of the Taliban. My uncle founded it. He was the basis for the character of General Zulfikar in Midnight's Children.
I see.
And yeah, and when the attack on the Satanic verses began, he made, I think he took out an ad in the paper to say that they never liked me anyway. Nothing to do with us. He's over there, we're over here. Don't come looking for me. So anyway, that's my family shame, the founder of the Pakistan Secret Service. That sentence about Pakistan being insufficiently imagined was in a way proven by the secession of Bangladesh. You know, the idea that a country could not survive on a religious identity alone. You know, it was not enough to hold together. Somebody else in Shame, well, the novel, you know, the Pakistan used to be called the West Wing and the East Wing. And I said, you know, you can't have two wings without a body. You know, there's nothing joining the wings. A bird can't fly if the wings are in some way connected to each other, and religion wasn't enough of a connection. You know, so I think that kind of statement came true. Actually, no, I mustn't take credit because the novel came out in 1983 and Bangladesh seceded in 1971, so I already knew. But I used to think that India had got things right to a degree that Pakistan had not. And I find it hard to believe that anymore. Not because of the improvement of Pakistan, but because of the deterioration of India. Right. And I mean, Pakistan still has the problems it always had. It has problems of, I mean, like an apparently democratic structure, which is actually a pawn for the military, where the religious groups have far too much power. We've just seen in Pakistan a kind of craven collapse of the government in the face of a protest by a terrorist group. Yeah. And the freedom of the terrorist people who had been arrested, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have a country that is in hoc to religious terrorist groups and the army, you know, and that's a very bad, that's a rock and a hard place. So and somehow Imran Khan of all people has to try and negotiate that.
Do you know him?
I've met him.
You would stop at that or comment?
I just think if I had to name the stupidest individual I'd ever met in my life, Imran would be on the short list.
The short list is quite short?
It's quite short.
Any other thoughts about Pakistan before we open up?
Look, I think also I worry about, I feel as if they're about to get bitten by their giving comfort to the Taliban all these years. You know, the Taliban were given safe haven in Pakistan. There was a Pakistani Taliban developed. And one of the reasons for it, it seems to me, was that India was working with post-Taliban Afghanistan, investing in it and so on. And Pakistan was afraid that it would have an India ally on the western frontier and India on the eastern frontier. And as you know, everything in Pakistan is determined by the obsession with India. And so they decided to play this game with the Taliban, which I think is a very, very dangerous game. Now the Taliban is back in power in Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban is still there. And of course, what the Taliban would really like is Pakistan. You know, I mean, Afghanistan is a broke, poor country, which is with huge problems, a colossal problem of heroin addiction, etc. Pakistan is a big country. You know, and so I feel that they have played a very dangerous game with the Taliban.
And India is going the Pakistani way now?
Well, it ain't quite there yet, but it doesn't, not going in a good way.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think the fact that India's status as a democracy has been downgraded by various international bodies, to me is tragic. Because India always used to take enormous pride in this sentence, the world's largest democracy, you know. And I would say that that's right, because it's very easy, or it is much easier for rich countries to be free countries. It is very hard for countries in which people are enormously poor to retain fundamental freedoms. You know, one of the things that has been glorious about India is that the people of the villages have been more committed to democracy than the people of the cities. You know, when Indira Gandhi lost the election at the end of the emergency, she won all the cities. She was annihilated because she lost all the villages. You know, so it was the ordinary people, the common people of India, who were committed to democracy. You know, and I always thought that was very beautiful. You know, and the fact that Mr. Modi, whatever you think about him, has managed to sell to a lot of the population of India the idea of Hindu majoritarian rule, which is anti-democratic. You know, but that he has managed to make that popular. In other words, to make the common people of India less committed to democracy than they were. That, I think, is a tragedy.
Thank you. We will open up now. We have done well with time. It's 3:20, a little over 3:20. So we've kept our part of the agreement, 20 to 25 minutes. And you can go to the microphone there. And if you identify yourself, that will be very nice, but you don't have to. Let's get the microphone. Professor Prerna Singh, Professor of Political Science, my colleague, and also on the steering committee of the center, which I direct.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Salman. Thank you. Really.
A bit louder,
Gauri,
if you can.
Shahzad, for this excellent conversation. And I'll start by saying I really speak as a fan. I think, as Gauri said, Midnight's Children, which I read as a teenager, was really a transformative book for me. And I returned to it. I returned to passages, but I really returned to the novel in whole. The question I had for you was really this quite evocative idea of novels as arguing with yourself. And I wanted to pick up on one particular issue, which I know you've been pressed on, but really just to kind of ask you, has the theme of what place women have played in your novels been a domain in which you have kind of gone back to your novels or had this conversation with yourself? Just in your remarks today, you spoke about the key role of your mother in your life. And so clearly women have informed you as a person. You spoke about Scheherazade as this kind of remarkable woman in literature who basically tells the world that stories can save you. But I was just wondering, to what extent do you feel as if women have informed the way the characters and the way in which you might yourself see that change or difference, or just a kind of dynamic of the portrayal of women in your corpus as a whole?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's true that a lot of my life has been shaped by having a family full of women, 3 sisters, no brothers. I always told them that was unfair because they all had sisters and a brother. I had only sisters, but I managed to survive. My sisters are very assertive people. They're not quiet and shy. You have to shout in my family to get heard. Anyway, I've always liked that. And I think, I know there are people who have disagreed, that to me, the women characters in my books are the kind of most interesting people. I think in The Moor's Last Sigh, the character of Aurora is, for me, the bit of the book that I'm still most fond of. In The Ground Beneath Her Feet, the character of Vina is, to me, by far the most interesting character in the book. I sometimes think the men are quite boring, or relatively speaking. I don't know. I'm writing a novel now of which the central character is a woman, and so the entire world is seen through her sensibility and her experience. That's what I think. And I think if people think differently, I'm sorry, but I can't do anything about it. The books are written, there they are. I think I would say it's extremely important that we, in these days, it's sometimes thought that men can't write about women and women can't write about men, and you can stay in your lane, and I think that's nonsense. I think essentially everybody can write about everything. The only question is whether they do it well or bad. And if you do it badly, you should be called out on it. But you don't have to ask anybody's permission. I was interested when I wrote The Golden House. There's a character in it who's transgender, who's strongly, or at least strongly considering transitioning, and is quite tormented by it. And I wanted to write about it because it's so much, a subject, and it's in people's minds. And also I thought, if I'm going to do this, I have to get it right, because obviously that's beyond my personal experience. And I do know some people who have transitioned. And in my case, the people I know, 2 people I know, friends of mine, are much happier than they were before. So it was actually quite a successful thing. But I wanted the character in the novel to be conflicted about it just because it's more interesting to write about, if somebody is not certain. So then you have to, what I was saying about Dickens, you have to get out of your comfort zone and go and find things out. You have to go talk to people who have experience which is not your experience. And anyway, so I did all that, and I wrote the book, and I thought, okay, well, I'm probably going to be slaughtered, because the times we live in are such that you get slaughtered for saying the wrong word. And I wasn't. And that means one of 2 things. It either means I did okay, or nobody read the book. Yeah, so what I'm saying is that whatever character, whether it's a woman or somebody with some other kind of experience which is not your own, your task as a writer is to try your best to get it right. And that often means having, if you like, the humility to understand that you don't know everything. And I teach in the journalism school at NYU, And one of the things I say to them is find things out. You know, and I think that's a rule for novelists as well as journalists. If you live in only your little personal world in your comfort zone, your world is restricted, doesn't matter who you are, you know, and leaving that and going somewhere to find something out is enormously helpful to you as a writer of fiction as well as of nonfiction. And so I've always thought that I like it when I finish a book, that if I know things that I didn't know when I started the book. You know, if the writing is a process of learning for me as well, you know, and I mean, that's how I approach it, that it's up to you all to decide if I do it well or badly.
Before the next question, just give me just 2 seconds. Can you be at this microphone? I have to reminded of something when Salman said that men can write about women very insightfully and women can write about men very insightfully. In the social sciences, there is an interesting example. So Barrington Moore Jr. wrote a very famous book, one of the classics of social science, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And he was the first major scholar in the West to recognize that India actually was becoming a stable democracy or had already become so in 1968. So when I had dinner with him, I said, "Did you go to India?" He said, "No." I said, "How did you write those about 73 pages?" He said, "I locked myself in the Widener Library of Harvard University, read everything I could on India and imagined India." And that's how I wrote it. And the chapter on India is truly extraordinary. Yeah. So it's just to affirm the point you're making. And let's hear some other questions. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Green. I'm a first-year undergraduate student. And I had a question regarding the discussion of the First Amendment. I was particularly struck and moved by this notion of the sacred stage or the sacred piazza. And I was wondering, how do we, in a society that is under threat from fascism, how do we combat fascism without ourselves denigrating the sacred stage and restricting certain types of discourse? How do we fight these ideas that at least I consider a fundamental threat to democracy and freedom and liberty without restricting discourse and without ourselves violating that sanctity?
How long have you got? That is the great question of our time. And let's start by saying what happened the last time this happened and the mistake that was made, which is Germany in the rise of the Nazi Party. Because Germany tolerated the Nazi Party to run in an election, that party then abolished the electoral system, which brought it to power. And so there's a thought there. Maybe the limiting point of freedom is to deny it to people who would deny freedom if they succeeded. And it's just a place to start the conversation, because there's still many questions to be asked and problems in that, you know. But as a starting point, the limiting point of freedom is to deny it to people who would remove freedom from others if they came to power. And I think we are in danger. In this country, we're in danger. You know, we came very close. You know, everybody thinks because the election held up and there was a transfer of power that everything's okay, but it was almost not okay. It was very, very, very close to being not okay. And there's no proof, there's no telling what will happen next time. So we do have to ask these questions, you know, and I do think in the light of the world we're in right now, my very long purist idea of the First Amendment is in some trouble. You know, because, as you say, there are people around who will abuse it ruthlessly. And it's a conversation this society needs to have. You know, what are the limiting points of freedom? And what I think they shouldn't do is to deny people who have different social ideas than yourself. You know, we're talking about, I mean, fascism is a very particular thing. You know, not everything is fascism. Somebody whose views about transgender people you don't agree with doesn't mean they're a fascist. It just means they have an idea that you don't like. Fascism is something which denies freedom to everybody. And we need to not use the term lightly. It's a very specific term. And it's a very specific danger right now. And if we get sidetracked into small arguments, we're going to lose sight of the big argument. And if we lose sight of the big argument, we are screwed. So that's what I'm saying. I think we do have to ask ourselves, what do we do about the internet? What do we do about the big, you know, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft? You know, what do we do about them? Because I do think we have created a monster that we can't control. You know, and I know that there is enormous value in new technology and in the information sphere. It gives us possibilities which we never had before. But it's also created a world in which the truth can be demolished. And when the truth is demolished, you've taken the first vital step towards fascism. Because what the fascist always says is, you can't believe anything anybody's saying to you. So believe me, there is no truth, I am the truth. When you get people to believe that, dictatorship is only one step away. That's what Hitler did. That's what Mussolini did. I am the truth. That's what the dictator seeks to do by replacing the truth with himself.
But isn't there the possibility that whoever is in power can say exactly that, regardless of what, you know, a political position they occupy? The fact that they are a dominant party in power, with the ability to set certain, you know, parameters or mandates. You know, I mean, I think that's a very popular kind of paradigm for us to think about today. But it is the relationship between the person holding power to you know,
but what I'm saying is,
to produce these edicts.
In most democracies, there's always people who will tell them they're full of shit. The problem here is the creation of a cult, you know, where one individual, whatever he says is considered to be true, and whatever is said against him is considered to be false. And this is not democracy, this is cultism, you know, and that's where we've come to. And I mean, I don't have for you a simple answer, you know. I only have for you a series of big questions that we all need to be talking about.
Professor Wazira Zamidar, my colleague in history.
Actually, specters of totalitarianism is perhaps a right place for me to ask my question. Thank you very much for being here and for having this event, Ashu. And this conversation has been wonderful. I wanted to push you thinking with specters of totalitarianism and the work of Hannah Arendt really in my mind. This thought about the exilic condition that you were describing. And it comes from actually my favorite book, or one of my many of your books, which are favorites of mine, Imaginary Homelands. It was a collection of essays that came out, I think, in the
Early 80s.
40 years after India's freedom.
And
Yeah,
I
somewhere
remember
around there.
reading it as an undergraduate, and I remember reading it alongside, say, Edward Said's Orientalism, and the two texts were incredibly important in that time to think with. And that essay, Imagining Homelands, begins with a photograph of your home and the loss of that home. And as you describe that loss of that home, and then you go to visit the home, you make an argument for expanding the universe by the end of it via Sol Bello. But what is, perhaps I'd like to hear more from you about is the loss of belonging. You said in today's conversation that I know where I'm from. I know where I belong. Am I using, if I'm putting too much emphasis on the question of belonging, it is because one of the ideas in Arendt's writing is there's a condition of statelessness that's produced, which is not just the loss of rights, but it's just loss of belonging. That is perhaps the most difficult, painful, and many of her other writings on exile and refugees come out of that rather painful condition of loss of belonging. And in a way, from that time, and Imagining Homelands might have been written, and today, can I press you to think about this question of the loss of belonging, of a home that maybe you can visit, but maybe not necessarily.
Well, I think, thank you. And thank you for.
So a distinction is being drawn between home and belonging.
Yeah.
Conceptually.
Let me just talk about, I think what with subject of home is, all of us have multiple descriptions of home. We have a childhood home, and then we have homes that we make for ourselves. And so all of us are familiar with the idea of the nature of home changing as we go through life. The question of belonging has become much more important, I think, in our time because of mass migration. So many people now live in places where they did not begin. They're in other cities, other countries, other continents. And so the question of what do you belong to is sharpened. And one of the things I've often, I've written, a lot about migration. And one of the things I think is that the self traditionally has a number of roots. One of those roots is the place where you are known. One of the roots is the community you live amongst, in which you are known. One of the roots is the language you speak. And one is whatever you might call it, broadly speaking, belief system. And the act of migration very often tears up all four roots. You're in a place you don't know. You're amongst people you don't know and who don't know you. Very often, the language you're surrounded with is not the language you were born into. And the belief system that is around you is not the one that you are most familiar with. What do you do? And this is the question that every migrant has to face. How do you rebuild a self when all its roots are torn up? Where do you put down the roots? What do you accept from the world to which you've come, and what do you hold on to from the world that you came from? And out of that, you have to create some new idea of belonging. And I think this is something which immigrant communities, migrant communities across the world it's a question at the front of their existence, and which, I've kind of spent a lifetime trying to answer, and as far as me, I said, I also think that what's happened is that because of the phenomenon of migration and movement, we're all much more used to a hyphenated self. We don't have to be just one thing. We can be a couple of things. We can be Indian American. That's okay. We can be African American. That's okay. The hyphen has become something significant, that we can put two kinds of belonging together and say, I belong to them both. I've lived in New York. Yeah. Yeah.
Suddenly the realization that you're beating the German.
Yeah.
And that
of who are you?
Yes, and so I actually
and then
suddenly realized.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Did everyone hear the question? Or? Yeah.
well, I'm very, what you're saying reminds me of, I remember watching television interviews with the French soccer team when they had just won the World Cup. Now, more than half the French soccer team is of African origin. Right. And its most famous player, Kylian Mbappe, is of Black African origin. And talking to these sports stars, one of the things they all said was, when we win, we're French. When we lose, we're Black. And something like that, I mean, I saw you wrote about the World Cup, the cricket thing, where because India got beaten by Pakistan, the Muslim bowler on the Indian team, Mohammad Shami, got abused everywhere. So, when he wins, he's Indian, and when he loses, he's Muslim. And I think there it is. It's in your face everywhere, and you have to deal with that. I think there's nothing to be done with it except deal with it.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a junior year at Brown. I think a lot of us have noted that your books have kind of come at inflection points, have served as references as we build our identity and try to understand who we are. It's a little lighter than Specters of Totalitarianism, but I would love to hear which books have provided that guidance and insight during your time at university or as you've grown as throughout your life.
Well, okay, that's another how long have you got question. That
we do have 15 minutes.
We have 20. All right, well, from India, I remember see, it's often the case that the writers who inspire you are not writing the way that you end up writing. So I adore the writing of R.K. Narayan. I've read every single one of his books, and many of them more than once. I love Malgudi, and I want to go there. I mean, Malgudi seems to be like India's Macondo. What Garcia Marquez did in Latin America, Narayan did in India, without ever having any magic in it, just human beings. And so, yeah, Narayan, I would say. I had this strange period when Mulkraj Anand decided he was my uncle. He would write me letters which he would sign Uncle Mulk, which gave me advice on how to proceed, which I ignored. So yeah, there'd been a lot of, I mean, Anita Desai is a writer that I really admire very much. And her daughter, Kiran.
Any Indian poets or lyricists?
The thing the Pakistani actually, the first great writer I ever knew was Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And Faiz was a very close friend of my family. My mother's older sister, Amina Majid Malik, was maybe his closest friend in Karachi. And I literally sat on his knee when I was a child. He read the nikah ceremony for my sister and then toasted her in whiskey. And what I learned from Faiz, because Faiz was two kinds of poet. He was a private poet, a love poet, and he was a public poet, a political poet. And in my view, equally good at both, which is rare. But it made me think that's the job. If that's what Faiz is doing, that's the job. That you write about the private matters of the human heart and human nature, and you write about public events and what your take is on what's happening in the world. And I think, a lot of the way I've thought about writing ever since was shaped by that childhood encounter with Faiz. So that's probably the most important South Asian figure.
Yeah. Oh, Hi.
Hi, Salman. Karan Mahajan, nice to see you. Thank you
He's
for a
joined the
wonderful,
faculty. He's a
Okay.
colleague.
thank you for a wonderful talk. My question was about the private labor of being a writer, and you've talked about how you have imaginatively entered India in many different phases of your career. Sometimes there's a big disruption. You can't go back for 6 years. Before Midnight's Children, I believe you went traveling around India for a while. I'm curious to hear of the ways in which you intellectually and mentally enter into India when you sit down to write. Like, how do you stay connected, especially when there's troubles with actually going to the place? And what that has looked like at different times, what it's looked like from England, let's say, what it looks like from America, and so on.
Well, as I said, with the Moor's Last Sigh, it was terrifying because I had to write a major novel about contemporary India without being able to set foot in it. And that was probably the scariest. After that, it's been less difficult to go. So that issue has diminished. But I do feel maybe a generation shift that there's in India which is not mine to write about anymore. That it's other people's reality. Maybe people half my age, have a different India that they inhabit on a daily basis, and it's hard for me to enter that. I mean, the book I'm writing now is a historical novel about India. So that has a different point of entry, which is reading. And I mean, I was a historian by training, so it's always pleasurable for me to dive into history. And I remember when I was writing The Enchantress of Florence and finding out about the Mughal Empire, or finding out more about the Mughal Empire, I remember thinking at that time that there's something very interesting happening in South India. And one of these days I have to get around to writing about South India. And immediately before the Mughal Empire, I'm talking about Vijayanagar and the Deccan Sultanates. That story, that story of the 5 Deccan Sultanates and the Vijayanagar Empire has been sort of sitting in my head for as long as I can remember. And that's what I'm writing about. And also one of the things that
That's what you're writing about now.
now, yeah, that's the next novel. And one of the things I've discovered is that everything we are told about Vijayanagar is bullshit. That the way the BJP presents it is Hindus good, Muslims bad. And that's just not what's going on at all. These worlds of the 5 Deccan Sultanates and the Hindu Empire were so interpenetrated. They intermarried. Vijayanagar had Muslim generals. Golconda had Hindu senior officers running the place. It was not a religious war. It was a war for power and land and so on, but religion was actually very low down on the list of what was driving it. So it's more interesting. It's more interesting than the cliche of Hindu Muslim. And so for me, this time, it's been a deep dive, into the past, into history books. And the other thing that's good about it is that the history quite often is a little bit vague. There's kind of gaps in the record, which allows fiction to come in. I also really liked it that the first ruling dynasty of Vijayanagar claimed to be descended from the moon. I thought, well, if you could say that, I could say anything. So it starts there. But I mean, yeah, so this time books are the point of entry, but who knows what the next one will be.
Let me, as a moderator here, say that the next 2 questions, maybe you can ask one after the other, and then we have Salman respond to those 2. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Anirudh. I'm a sophomore undergrad here. So in contrast to a lot of your writing and discussion today, I think there's another strand of imagination in science fiction, which looks at things very differently. For example, the novel I'm thinking of right now is Snow Crash, which imagines a fragmented America where everyone spends all their time in virtual reality. And then you have a lot of people, especially in the tech industry, who try to take this imagination and put it into practice in real life, foisting these technology for whatever mass effects onto society. So my question kind of is, what then is the role of literature and imagination in these kind of within these worlds of technology and within these worlds of machines?
Role of literature in science fiction in general, right? Yeah. Anyway, he will interpret it. Can you ask the second question?
I'm Sigh, I'm a sophomore too. And I was wondering, where do you see the writer today and how has that role transformed since you started?
Okay, well, I love science fiction. I mean, there was a period of my life when I read nothing except science fiction. I mean, I was a teenager, but I read everything. There's kind of like classic science fiction, and then there's the kind of hardcore, deep fan science fiction. And I went right down into the hardcore. I was reading people called things like Clifford D. Simak and James Blish and L. van der Vogt and Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. And
Really were into
this
it.
is the hardcore. I especially love science fiction because of its ability to be a vehicle for the novel of ideas. Ideas about the future, about the present, about etc. A lot of it's very badly written, but that's okay. A lot of everything is very badly written. The thing that put me off science fiction after a while, I'm talking about in the impossibly distant time of my years, teenage years. First of all, something about the poor quality of the prose eventually got under my skin. And then the fact that it was in those days a very male-dominated form, and women tended to be either like kind of Barbarella or people wearing lab coats, and there was like nothing else that women could be. They either would be babes or scientists, and that's it. And I just got bored. Now it's completely changed. There's a lot of brilliant science fiction by women writers, and a lot of the writing is better. Better writers are doing it. Margaret Atwood is doing it. Ursula Le Guin is doing it. So the quality of the stuff is better. I still read. I mean, there's bits of science fiction in a lot of my novels. I mean, Quichotte ends up with a science fiction ending, and there are some science fiction stories which I've carried around with me, which actually a couple of which I used in Quichotte. There's a wonderful, come back to your religion question, there's a wonderful story called The 9 Billion Names of God, in which a monastery in the mountains in Nepal hires a computer company to put up a mega computer so that they could count the 9 billion names of God. And the computer people say, well, what will you do when it'll do that in a week? What will you do afterwards? And they say, no, you don't understand. It's the purpose of the universe to count the 9 billion names of God. So when we've done it, the universe will end. And so the computer people think, okay, well, we better get out of here fast before they get disappointed. And they leave. And when they're on the train the plane flying back to America, they look out of the window and they see that one by one, the stars are going out. Beautiful, beautiful story. So yeah, again, you see that's a completely religious story, but it fulfills the beauty requirement. And so yes, I mean, I've always loved science fiction and I've used bits of it sometimes, and not sometimes. The question about the role of the writer is a very hard thing to make a general statement about. There are writers who want no public role, and who are private people, and for whatever reason, they don't want to get engaged with that larger arena. And that has to be okay. That has to be okay. Marcel Proust could hardly leave his room. He was so messed up in so many ways that the famous cork-lined room was designed to just keep the world out. And yet he created the world better than any other French novelist ever.
Jane Austen?
I mean, Jane Austen, it's interesting about Jane Austen because her books are exactly contemporary with the Napoleonic Wars.
But she never refers to those wars.
And she never, the Battle of Waterloo, well, the Russian campaign is 1812.
Yeah.
And that's the year of Pride and Prejudice. And there is no mention of this colossal war in her books.
Right.
But there's a reason for that, which is that in that time, public life and private life were quite separate. You know, if she's talking about her characters up in their little vicarage somewhere, going to balls looking for husbands, geopolitics doesn't impinge. You know, the function of the British Army is to show up at parties in red uniforms and look cute, which is an important function. And so she can wholly describe her characters, profoundly describe her characters, without needing to draw in any public elements. You know, now we live in a world where everything is squashed together, you know, where what's happening in the news impinges on our lives immediately and directly. And so it's harder to write like that now, you know, but she did it. So I think we have to respect those writers who wish to stay away from engagement, if you like, you know. And then there are other writers who don't feel like that, you know, and I guess I'm on that team, although I'd really like to be on the other team. A lot of my time, I think, wouldn't it be nice to just say home? And maybe I'll start doing that, except this is fun.
It's 4 o'clock and it's time on behalf of the Center for Contemporary South Asia, Watson Institute, Brown University, to thank Salman Rushdie for sharing his insight, reflections, and his time with us. Thank you also to Gauri for taking part in this conversation yet again after 18 years with me. And a special thanks to Shahzad for joining the conversation on a domain about which all of us have something to say, but know very little about religion. So, and thank you to this audience, and thank you those who are online.